Welcome to the Beacon Hill Podcast, helping you grow in your faith and shine for Christ. Thanks for joining us. Now here are your hosts, Pastor G.J. Farmer and the Beacon Hill Baptist Church staff.
Welcome to another episode of the Beacon Hill Podcast. I'm here with Joel and Josh today. We've got Josh, we've got the jokester himself, Joel, back for another appearance. And the last time you were here, man, you just slayed it with the outro.
Yeah.
So the bar has been set high.
Oh, yeah. You got any more jokes?
That's why they bring me here.
If you didn't watch it, it was episode 1 of this. We're calling it a season. You know, that's what they do with podcasts. Season 2, episode 1. Joel it was kind of like a little bit of an inside joke for our church, though.
Yeah.
Like the We Before Me series we had.
It's trying to be all things to the people here.
That's great. Well, what a
Good
segue
job,
into
Joel.
what we're talking about today. Go back and listen to that joke, by the way, and listen to the podcast if you haven't, because Joel is just a treat to have on. So
Smash that like and subscribe. Hit that bell for notifications, people.
Smash.
Man,
That's right.
we're going to have 2 more subscribers because you said that. Hey, it's another week that we've been in the core values. Appreciated Bill Curtis being on last week, by the way. Go listen to that episode 2. Basically, I just interviewed him about what it means to follow Christ and abide in Christ as he was preaching on during the Revive conference, and it was just great to hang out with him and kind of go a little bit more in depth on that passage. But we're back in our series about our core values here at Beacon Hill. And yesterday we talked about how our second of our core values is that we have an outward focus. That we're going to continue to have an outward focus. And basically the gist of that is we're going to be mission-minded, all about sharing the gospel with people in our community and across the world, but also talking about the importance of staying culturally aware so we can better connect with people and better reach people where they are. We use 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 through 23 as the basis of that. And Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, sharing with them kind of some of his methods that he used to reach people. And you can really see his heart behind it. Let me read the passage. I'll just read the whole thing. He says, "Although I'm free from all and not anyone's slave, I've made myself a slave to everyone in order to win more people. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, to win those under the law. To those who are without the law, like one without the law, though I am not without God's law, but under the law of Christ, to win those without the law. To the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I become all things to all people, so that I may by every possible means save some. Now I do all this because of the gospel, so that I may share in the blessings." Out the gate, I mentioned in the sermon on Sunday that 5 times in this passage, Paul said his goal was to win people, and obviously that's talking about to win people to Christ, to grow the kingdom of God. To do that as a church and as individuals, we have to maintain an outward focus. Talked about a few weeks ago about the tendency for churches to turn inward. And I see that, as I mentioned then in the sermon, I see that more like as churches age. And I don't just mean like the congregation, like the individuals getting older. I'm just meaning the age of the church. As a church gets older, its tendency is to become, I guess, not just more inward focused, but to just become more relaxed and comfortable with how everything is and forget some of the reason why they started as a church from the beginning.
Yeah.
I've served at churches of different ages. We mentioned Cornerstone Baptist, where Bill Curtis is. When I went there, I believe the church had its 10-year anniversary when I went there, if I remember correctly. So it was a pretty new church, and it was like laser focused. I've worked at First Baptist in Somerset, which is over 200 years old. Scottsville Baptist, which is somewhere like 165 years old, something like that. And then here, which is next year, we're going to be 60 years old. So I've kind of been all across the board. And one thing I can tell you is that it just seems like the older the church is, the more we have to remind ourselves to have an outward focus. And I think that even starts to come in at like 15, 20 years, 25 years, those kind of things. It starts to turn it a little bit. Why do you all think, and we can kind of discuss this a little bit, why do you think it's important for not just churches but also individuals to constantly be reminded to have an outward focus? And like I said, just churches in general, but just of the importance of it, and saying that we're going to deliberately, almost like we said with the being biblically devoted, that we're going to say it out loud, and we're going to constantly remind ourselves that we have to have an outward focus. Why is that important? What are your all's thoughts on that?
I think it's important for us to be reminded, just because of how easy it is for us to just lose sight of the mission that we have. It's so natural for us, like, one of my favorite hymns, talking about prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. And that's about our relationship with Christ, but I think it's similar just in everyday life. There's so much that wants our time and our focus that it's easy for us to forget about the purpose that we're there and the mission that God has given us through the Great Commission. And really, we see through being a devoted follower of Christ, it's natural for us to point towards ourselves. But what we see, the two great commandments, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, those two great commandments are outward focused. They're not about us, but loving God. And the more we're like God, we love others.
Do you feel like, because I was thinking about not just for the church, that age thing, but like for the individual, that the longer you're a Christian, the easier maybe it is to lose sight of the mission, maybe? Like, I'm just thinking about me, because I don't know, I want to be careful on this, because obviously the longer you're a Christian, the more you're supposed to be growing in sanctification, and it should increase your understanding of the importance of sharing the gospel. But I think also, like, I remember, I was just a young kid when I got saved, but how excited I was to tell people that I got saved, and, obviously encourage them to think about it and stuff like that. Like, you have moments that you're super excited, but then kind of, if you get in times, you mentioned wandering, but if you get in times where, let's say your walk with the Lord has grown cold for whatever reason, or just stagnant, I don't know. I think in those times it can be easy to forget personally that you're on mission, and this is the big call of your life, is to have an outward focus. Also, I'll add, I think sometimes we can get so focused on our own personal discipleship that we're like, the idea of making disciples is like, I'm making myself a disciple, rather than thinking about, okay, our mission is to make other disciples, not just to make ourselves a disciple and to keep growing and learning, but we grow and learn so we can see other people come to know Jesus. That's really the goal. I don't know. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, every church initially started out somehow as a church plant. When you receive church plants and they go into an area, and, that's like their core, they're laser focused on reaching the community, bringing people in, sharing the gospel with us. And I think as years go by, sometimes churches can fall into the just, kind of settling, that, oh yeah, we got a few hundred people or whatever it is, and now we want to just focus on just mainly discipleship. But it's like Joel said, with those two commandments, love the Lord your God and then love others. We at our best as Christians, the best way we can love others is to share the gospel with them, and to remember that in our own lives, and to remember as a church, because you're moving along in sanctification, and even if you have a good, growing in discipleship with your relationship with the Lord, but we know that one of the highest points of sanctification is Matthew 28 is, bringing people, reproducing disciples and everything. And I just think that sometimes churches and individuals get caught up in It's great. I'm going to church, have a great grow group, sermon's great, worship's great, which is all discipleship, but that's just a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Sharing the gospel, trying to bring others to church, showing them the gospel, that should be our end goal.
Mm-hmm. And let me just say, because some of the other core values that we're going to talk about will touch on this, but I do think there's a little bit, you don't want to be a mile wide and an inch deep as a church. You don't want to be like just all about like seeing people saved and then baptized and then doing nothing else after that.
Leaving them hanging.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard of churches who baptize hundreds of people, but it's like, okay, where are these people? Like, there's nothing that's happened where they've got connected to the church or even a church after that, and that's not a good thing either. So anyway, I just think one of the things we have to think about is like, yeah, we do want people discipled and growing in their faith, growing deeper in their knowledge of Scripture, their love for the Lord, and we're going to talk about those in some of the upcoming core values. But also the danger is for churches to say, no, growing in knowledge and understanding is what it's all about, and then just lose sight of evangelism and lose sight of reaching people. So Paul mentions that he's become all things to all people. I think one of the knee-jerk reactions to this can be, well, does that mean that we got to go and sin with everybody or condone or approve what they're doing to become all things to all people? Or does that mean that, we're going to look exactly like the world if we become all things to all people? And it's almost like that phrase is like a dangerous thing to say. Yeah. But the truth is that phrase is in the Bible, and that's exactly how Paul went about his ministry. And I think it's a great model for every Christian to think about. But so there are things that it means and things that it doesn't mean. So how would you all characterize that? Let's talk, for example, like when you hear all things to all people and looking at Scripture, what are the things that we say it has to mean this, but it can't mean those things? What are your all's thoughts on those?
Well, my first thought when I saw the doesn't mean, because I've had these conversations with people before, is I always think of the word compromise. People think that they have to compromise what's in the Word, compromise what they believe in order to try to draw people to Christ. And what we don't sometimes forget is, all we are is the vessel. We live our lives according to the truths of Scripture. God is the one that draws them and saves them, and we don't have to, compromise our belief system. Just in order. God doesn't want us to do that. He was never say, yeah, okay, well, it's okay that you go sin with this person in whatever way, because at least you're going to invite them to church, tomorrow and things like that.
Yeah. I agree. With it, we have our convictions and we're going to stand to them and we're not going to compromise them. But being all things to all people is looking for the areas where we connect, where we can. Where Paul, at times when he was in the city of Athens, he used their worship of an unknown God to use it as an avenue to be able to share the gospel, finding areas of connection. An example from my life, before I was here, I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, and I know we care about basketball here, and they care about basketball, college basketball, a ton there. But I moved from there to Ohio, and oftentimes when I was here in Kentucky, I would use sermon illustrations about Kentucky basketball, Louisville basketball, and everyone would connect because they cared about it. I went there to Ohio, and they could give less of a rip about Kentucky basketball. And really basketball in general, they were all about Ohio State and Michigan football. So I began to watch some of these football games. I started, instead of using those college basketball illustrations, I would use football illustrations, and it connected with them more. It was trying to find a place where you can meet someone so that you can connect them to the gospel better.
Joel became a Ohio State fan.
When I was there, I'm back now.
I don't know that a Louisville fan's any better. I think that might be
And that's
worse.
when we talk about not compromising. Like, I'm not a UK fan and sinning in
so
that way.
you're still a Louisville fan
Yeah.
in UK territory,
Yeah.
but you'll talk about UK athletics, but you're still a Louisville fan.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there are certain lines you don't cross.
That's right. You know,
Okay, I
my
see.
conscience is clear before the Lord. That's for sure.
Pastor Jake can't cross those lines.
Yeah, no, he's a Duke fan, and that's not okay. Just in general, we'll have to convert him. But so there's an element of this that we do every single week in things like, you know, what Joel was talking about, but also like the fact that we have a children's ministry, a student ministry, different groups for different demographics of people. That in and of itself is part of this, right? It's like saying we can't expect everybody to learn and to grab a hold of, the same method. And so we have these different approaches as a church to reach different types of people. There's an element of this as an individual that that if you were to talk to your kids or grandkids or somebody at work or wherever, like your approach to them and talking about these things is going to be different based on maybe their interests or what they can understand, what they can understand.
Culture.
So, yeah, I mean, all of that's going to have an impact. I think also there's an element of this that we see culturally, that what's on people's minds is our approach sometimes to how we do things. Like, for instance, at Christmas time, if we're going to share the gospel, we start with the Christmas story typically because that's on everybody's mind. We don't start with Easter, in that frame of mind on Christmas. We do that on Easter. Yes, all of that's part of the story, but there's a frame of mind that the culture is in that you kind of approach it in those ways. Similarly, as we're thinking about reaching people in Somerset, Kentucky in 2024, there's an element of this that says all things to all people absolutely cannot mean that we get involved in sin or that we do things that the Bible specifically says that we should or shouldn't do. That we shouldn't do. We do things that the Bible says we should do. But anyway, you know what I'm getting at. So what Paul says here is in the realm of the freedom that he has in Christ, he would say, like if he is talking to a Jew by choice or a Jew by birth, he will do things, maybe like, for instance, I'll give you just a real life example. When I went to Israel several years ago, we ate at restaurants that were kosher restaurants. When we went to specific holy places, we had to wear a head covering or a hat to go to those places. I know in my heart and in my mind, I don't have to wear a head covering to worship the Lord. In fact, in the United States, some people would say that's disrespectful to wear a hat while you pray or to wear it in a building. Over there, it's the opposite. But while we were there, so as to not offend the people, I ate kosher and I wore a hat or a head covering anytime I was supposed to in the holy places. And the reason was because I didn't want to offend those people in that culture. That's how I'm viewing Paul as approaching this. He knows that he's free from the law, but at the same time, he submits himself to that as he can, and it's no problem within the grand scheme of things. And so we're talking about things that in some ways are preferential or things that really don't matter as far as is it following Christ or not. Like these things are just things that we have options to do. And in those things, those are the things that we're saying, hey, we want to become all things to all people. If that's what it takes to reach you, then yeah, I'll do that. And I'll put aside maybe some of my preferences or some of my things that I'm free to do and say I'm not going to do those things or vice versa in order to reach you, in order to to talk to you about the gospel. Any other thoughts on that? I don't want to belabor it, but I do want to make sure we do that justice to make sure folks understand kind of the approach. In thinking about that, I do think we had talked about or thought about talking about a little bit times that we've had various times where we've approached something differently. Joel's already shared something. I know for me, I think about my dad and his illusion ministry, and I had an opportunity to participate in that. I did that this past Easter. That's something that when we do the magic shows, as they're called, or illusions, whatever you want to call them, we use that as a barrier to entry, if you will, like a way to get into to people's lives and connect with them, to basically be able to share the gospel. That is one way that, we say, hey, we come all things to all men. You like this kind of stuff? We'll do a show and use this to share the gospel. Our church has done things like Upward Basketball and other things throughout the year as creative ways to approach that. Josh, did you want to chime in maybe with something in your life that you see that you said, hey, I've kind of tweaked that or whatever to share with somebody?
I couldn't think of a specific time where I had to maybe adapt approach on the fly, but what it made me think of is if you've ever been on a mission trip and gone to different cultures, whereas, if I was sharing the gospel, with it in a coffee shop or somebody, we're dialoguing back and forth. And then I went up to a mission trip one time to Uganda, and we were right in the tribes of Africa where they were. And the method that we trained on to share was using, what you've heard of, is the EvangeCube. And it's because these people have basically never even heard the story. And so the guy told me, training was like, words, they won't just get through the words, even through the translator. Mm-hmm. It's like you have to use the visual pictures on the EvangeCube with your testimony or preaching or whatever it is. And their research is that's what they found, their culture that worked the best, rather than just trying to, hey, share somebody about Jesus, share them about your life, whatever. It was like use those big, how to tie in your testimony and the information of the gospel with something visual. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think whatever the approach is, we're going to think about, or hopefully going to think about those people. I was, thinking about how people say, well, what we do in church shouldn't look like the world or shouldn't look like culture.
Yeah.
And there's an element of that we say that's absolutely true. Like the Bible is clear that followers of Jesus are to be set apart from the world. And there's a saying that we have that is right in one context, but not in another, in the world, but not of the world. That idea is this idea like, hey, we're in the world, but we're not going to live in a sinful way. However, the Bible also clearly says that, Jesus basically says, like, if you weren't supposed to be here and be part of the world, like, I would take you out, like, you would be removed. There's an element like the reason we're here is to be involved in the world and to be involved in people's lives. Otherwise, like, there'd be no reason for the mission or anything like that. I was also going to say this idea of like saying, well, church shouldn't be like the culture or be like the world. You travel around to multiple cultures, even in the United States, but across the world, as Josh mentioned, you will see that church services take on the culture in every country, in every place. There's an element of that. And that's the reason, honestly, in America, I think that's the reason why we have different worship styles and different denominations, and because it's all like the people who go there, it's part of their culture and part of how they were raised and things like that. And, there have been studies done, and actually this is missionaries tried to do this years ago, of saying we're going to take an Americanized version of church and we're going to go overseas and try to make their churches look like ours as we start up churches in these, mission fields. And it did not go well. In fact, if I remember correctly, because I was reading some of this, it's been a while ago, but if I remember correctly, it like disrupted their cultures that they had there, not in a good way, but negatively. It just impacted the people in a negative way. It didn't do what they wanted it to do. And even from that, we saw you've got to meet people where they are. And that's really what this is all about. Any other thoughts on those things? Joel, you're the missions guy, so I kind of thought maybe you would chime in there. But anyway, I wanted to talk for a moment about some challenges that sometimes we might face to having an outward focus and maintaining an outward focus. We talked about a few maybe already, but as individuals or as a church, what are some challenges that you think are there of not just, let's say, not just maintaining an outward focus, but the idea of becoming all things to all people? What are some challenges that you maybe feel like arise from that? As you're thinking on that, I know for me and just as a church, I mentioned yesterday one of the challenges as being staying creative. And we also mentioned even in our core value itself of being culturally aware. Sometimes we can get in a bubble and not be aware of what it takes to reach people, and not think of new ideas and things, and just grow stagnant in our approach, and then kind of get a little bit ineffective because of that. But what are some other challenges you guys can think of?
Yeah, I think about that, and just the perspective of sometimes we get stuck in doing the things that we're traditionally doing, but we forget about the fact that a lot of the things that we traditionally like to do, we've not always done. There are the things of the faith and church history that we've done for 2,000 years. But something, for instance, we've all gone to Sunday school our whole lives if we've been in church. But in the course of church history, it's, relatively new, actually. My home church in Louisville, it was actually came out of a new initiative called Sunday School. They started a Sunday school sponsored by a church on a church corner of 9th and O, or a street corner of 9th and O Street. And then here, 100 or so years later, it's grown and served and reached the gospel, and it's this big church, but it started off from a new initiative. So we take for granted that, Sunday school, it's always just been, but really it came out of the creativity of people that saw throughout the United States that there were children that needed Christ, and they started this new thing, and look at what it's done. And so we need to ask the question, what is the new thing? Not that we're chasing after fads, but what is the need in our community that we can fill? Just like that Sunday school filled that particular need there in that culture and reach people. Is there something new? Bus ministry, something we've just gotten used to now, that started in the 60s and 70s. But that's not always been done. It was a need, and they saw it, and they were creatively, and we've seen the fruit of that. So what here in the 2020s, what is the vacuum that Beacon Hill Baptist Church, what can we find to reach people with the gospel?
And that's where I mentioned, the idea of like being creative, because it's in my opinion, it's easy to do what we've always done. It may not be the most effective, but the easiest thing is to just keep doing what you're doing, and not try anything new or change anything. But as I said, easy doesn't mean that it's effective. And as we think about what it takes to reach people today, actually sitting down and thinking of that is a, kind of a task in and of itself that's a little bit difficult. But once you come up with that, then actually creating the thing that meets those needs or meets people where they are, that's a whole other task in and of itself. And so as we're talking about this, we were talking about the core values and putting these things into place in our church. And our staff, we were talking about how essentially, like, saying these things out loud, that's the easy part. But then when you actually think about implementing this stuff in the years to come, like, we're essentially creating years worth of work for ourselves and our church. But, it's a good thing, because this is the kind of work that we should be chasing after, not just filling the calendar, not just, doing programs or whatever without any clear aim. Having, a clear aim and mission and core values, all this stuff makes it more meaningful, in my opinion. What about you, Josh?
Yeah, and something I was thinking of that's already been mentioned a couple times, but like, it doesn't have to be a bad thing that takes us away from an outward focus. We can get complacent. Things could be going great. We could be settled into our church or our Sunday school group or whatever, and just kind of feel really good in our bubble, but still being disobedient, to what Jesus commands us in the New Testament. I mean, you said it on Sunday, 50 years ago, they were doing things to reach people. Now we're here, and we hope 50 years from now the methods may not be the same, but the mission should be the same. The outward focus, whatever we're doing, like Joel said, different things we have to try to reach the culture around us. And as much as we like growing our church in numbers, which is important, the most important thing is how are we reproducing disciples? How are we having this horizontal growth to go along with our vertical growth? Again, and not letting people just kind of flail about. Like you said, there's churches that baptize a lot of people, but their discipleship is not going up. People are not getting plugged into the life of the church in order to help those people learn how to reproduce disciples and things like that.
And I've seen, as I mentioned, like the opposite too, where churches don't baptize anybody, and they're just
all about discipleship.
Bible studying all the time and stuff. And what you see in Scripture, like, is we do Bible study and are fed spiritually and do life together, all this stuff, because of the mission to reach people. And what we are doing within the walls of the church should impact and create a force for what we're doing outside of the church. And that really is the heart of the mission. It's to make disciples, see people come to Jesus, see them grow in their faith, so that way they too can make disciples. And we got to constantly be thinking about that. We talked about this a little bit, but I want to wrap up with this idea is, why is our willingness to change and trying new methods important for reaching people with the gospel? In a lot of places in life, but I would say particularly in the church, it can be very difficult for people to be willing to not just like accept change, but to go like to change just in general. There are a lot of things in life that changes that kind of can aggravate us sometimes. I mean, I'm at an age now, recently my iPhone did an update to the operating system, and there were some things that changed about it, and I'm kind of at an age where I'm like, I don't want to fool with learning all of these different things. Like, let's just keep it the way it is and not change it. But how many years can I do that until my phone's obsolete? I think the same idea is true of the church. Is like, we could say, well, we're not going to change anything. Well, how many years can we go by till those methods are obsolete? So I'm thinking about this, why is the willingness to change and try new things important? What are your all's perspectives on that? And we can kind of wrap up with this thought.
Well, there's always new people to be reached. And, as a student pastor, we see I've been doing this for almost 10 years now, and even the things that the students are interested in now is much different than what they were interested back then.
What's a Sigma?
What is a Sigma?
Yeah, this will tell you. If you know what a Sigma is, man, you're really reaching the teenagers.
Beyond the Greek
Sigma is kind of, like a lone wolf.
Okay.
Yeah, but kind of in a bad way.
But like 5 years ago, it was just a Greek letter.
That's right. Yeah.
But now teenagers have all this slang, and I've got a son who's in the student ministry, and he'll talk about all this stuff, and I'm like, what are you even saying?
Yeah.
But that's kind of what you're talking about, like with student ministry. I think student ministry probably changes more rapidly than, I could be wrong, but than any other ministry.
Yeah.
You're not wrong.
if you think you're going to go 10 years and just do the same stuff you've done, I think, you're in for a rude awakening probably.
Yeah. And, it's kind of what we're talking about. There are timeless things about teenagers, just like there are timeless things we are going to do in worship and reaching people. But the language, the methods, the culture is evolving. And if I just continued to do the same thing that I did back when I was a teenager that my youth pastor did to me, as much as I would enjoy it, it probably would not connect with the students of today.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to reach them, to hopefully reach new ones to know Christ, and those who do know Christ to grow deeper in their relationship, we have to meet them where they are.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts, Josh?
Oh, I was going to use the student ministry example. Since
Yeah, I mean, that's just
over 20 years.
But while they're fast paced, the truth is the world is changing whether we like it or not. I shared a meme with you all that said something like, what did it say? I forget. Something like the past is dead or something. It was like aimed at our generation, and it had the Toys R Us giraffe. Wasn't his name Jeffrey?
Jeffrey. It said, the world you were born into doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
That hurt me personally.
And we could say, it says the past is dead. The world you were born into no longer exists. And it was a picture of Jeffrey the giraffe from Toys R Us when we were kids. And we could ignore that as much as we want and say, no, that's not true. But there is an element that it is true about that. Like, yeah, it's still the world, but so many things have changed even in the last 30 years. And so because of that, we've got to make sure as a church that we're constantly reaching people where they are and connecting with them. And, somebody asked me, like, how do you decide what approach you take when you're dealing with a big group of people? Let's say all of Somerset. How do you decide what approach you take? Well, when Paul talked about his approach, I think the best rule of thumb is we're going to take the approach that would reach the most people, like whatever that is, and whatever that is, and the culture you're in, or the workplace you're in, or like whatever approach that would reach the most people, because that's what we're all about, to win as many people as we can to the Lord. So if anything today, I hope you've been encouraged, not just with the ideas of saying, hey, we need to be thinking about new things and the methods we go about it. I also hope you've been encouraged in the idea of sharing your faith with someone, or thinking about living on mission yourself. There are different approaches that can be done, but I also think, and there's something to be said about this, and I haven't even planned on talking about this, but God has gifted us in different ways that we can reach. Maybe you can reach somebody that I can't reach, and Joel can reach people I can't reach, and Josh can reach people that I can't reach. Like if your gift is writing, or if your gift is, I don't know, and kind of confuse gifts and talents together, but if you can cook, or if you can play an instrument or whatever, like you can use the gifts and talents God's given you to reach people where they are and where you are, because he's gifted you to do those things. And so don't take those things for granted either. Think about ways that in the context that you are in and the giftings that you have, some ways that you can reach people. Any other thoughts today, guys? We kind of went a little long, but enjoyed the conversation. Glad to have you all with us. Let me mention a couple things. If you stuck with us this long, you won't care for another minute. So let me mention a couple other things to you. If you're involved on Wednesday nights here at Beacon Hill, I would love to have you get connected to our next round of Beacon Midweek. This coming week, we are going to be off on Wednesday nights, but after that, we kick back off with new studies. You can go to beaconhillbaptist.com to sign up for those right now. As well, maybe you've been thinking about church membership in our church. Prospective members class will start up at the end of October. If you go to beaconhillbaptist.com/membership, you can find out more about that. And then we've got other stuff that you can check out, the church app or the website or whatever, like Bear Wallow and Trunk of Treats, all that kind of stuff coming up this fall.
We are not off this week. Next week is Just that week.
Yes, but this comes out Thursday.
You're so smart.
So, yes, we are off this coming Wednesday. We're recording this on Mondays, but by the time you hear it, this week will be over for Wednesdays.
We're time travelers.
Yeah.
Back in time.
But we always try to stay current with the time we're in to reach people.
Nailed it.
I did your thing.
Yeah.
And the wee little man. All right, you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Beacon Hill Podcast. For more information about Beacon Hill Baptist Church, visit beaconhillbaptist.com.